Hey, welcome to the Gentle Rebel podcast, where we explore the intersection of sensitivity, creativity, and the impact of culture within, around, and between us. In this episode, I am going to share a conversation that I had with Andrew May, who I became aware of through a post on the HSP Connect site a little while ago, where he'd shared reflections and notes from a presentation that he'd given about sensory processing sensitivity and the methods of research surrounding it, and kind of updating people on the HSP scale that had just been introduced and updated. Andrew is a researcher and lecturer at Queen Mary University of London and works closely with Michael Pluess on studies exploring sensory processing sensitivity and genetics and the measurement of sensitivity across different populations and cultures. Absolutely loved meeting and chatting with Andrew about this stuff. The conversation that I share in this episode is, the first time we'd connected and met, and he's got a really great way of communicating. So my hopes that this would be a valuable conversation, not just to have for myself, but to share with others, were definitely met. I wanted to get him on the podcast because he's got a really grounding perspective on the field of sensitivity research. And I've seen him kind of distinguish between SPS, or being a highly sensitive person, and other traits that might overlap but are also different, such as autism, ADHD, and giftedness, the idea of giftedness. I often see people respond with confusion around this stuff. And so, I'd seen Andrew address this before, and I thought he has a really helpful approach to clarifying the core differences between these things. So we talk about that towards the end of the conversation. And I was also drawn to Andrew because he brings that sort of scientific rigor and depth, but also a cultural awareness to the ongoing conversation about what it means to be highly sensitive in the modern world, and some of the baggage that comes around the labels and the misunderstandings that might emerge from that as well. So he holds things, not as set in stone, but as the best of our knowledge in an evolving area of study that impacts and is impacted by the cultural context that we are operating in. The other thing I must say before I share this interview is I apologise about my voice in it and my slightly droopy demeanour at times. I woke up with a horrific cold that morning, and I have edited out as many of the coughs and sniffs that I could. But yeah, to be honest, one of the worst editing experiences of my life. Yeah, joined with the conversation I had with Jacob Norby later that day, where much the same thing happened for many of the same reasons. So I apologise if your ears are as sensitive to that kind of thing as mine are. Hopefully the nature of our discussion will distract you from it if it is a problem. The good thing is Andrew did most of the talking. So yeah, you don't have to listen to me sniffling my way through the conversation too much. All right, here we go.
We're about to witness the greatest miracle of the machine age.
The Gentle Rebel Podcast.
I'm so glad you could come. This is going to be such an exciting day. I hope you enjoy it. I think you will.
Andrew May, it is really nice to be with you. How are you doing? Welcome to the Gentle Rebel podcast.
Hi, Andy. Yes, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm doing very well today.
Good. So the reason I wanted to get you on to the podcast and have a conversation with you really was the main thing, was some of the stuff that you've been doing with sensitivity research recently. So a couple of posts that you've posted in the HSP Connect community, and it's been really encouraging and great to see. And yeah, I just wanted to meet you and have a chat and that kind of thing. So yeah, it'd be great to start maybe with your bit of your background, your story, like how you came to be a researcher in that area, and yeah, anything else related to that.
Yes, sure. So just to give you some background to my own journey to becoming a sensitivity researcher. So I started at university studying genetics and biology. That was my passion at high school. And I followed that path all the way along to a master's degree. So I completed a master's in human genetics. But that was also about the time that I started to learn about sensitivity. So, like many highly sensitive people, I went through a difficult period adjusting to university and all the challenges that come along with it. And it was through that process that I started to go to therapy, and my therapist pointed out this book that Elaine Aron had written about the highly sensitive person. And that's when all the pieces started to fall into place, which is so often the experience for us highly sensitive people, when we discover more about our trait. So that helped me understand the difficulties I was going through, and it also sparked a sort of curiosity in me. I wanted to know more about sensitivity, of course, because it had such a personal connection to me. And as I read more, I realized there hadn't been much research in my home country of South Africa. In fact, there hadn't been much done on the African continent altogether. So sensitivity at that point had really only been studied sort of in developed Western countries. So it was such a desire for me to explore that avenue further that I decided I'm going to switch professions, switch career trajectories, and move into psychology. And I enrolled to do a PhD in psychology. And I was very lucky to come across a supervisor who was willing to go on this journey with me and explore sensory processing sensitivity, even though it was very unknown within the South African context. And so, yes, I did my PhD on sensitivity. And then I was very fortunate to be awarded a scholarship after that to study as a postdoctoral fellow with Professor Michael Pluess, who's one of the leading sensitivity researchers. And that's what I've been doing for the past 3 years, is working under his leadership, exploring sensitivity in different ways, particularly within refugee children.
Right. Oh, fascinating. Yeah. Yeah, it's a conversation I have a lot with people, is that the cross-cultural elements of it, and, has it been studied in other contexts and all of that kind of thing. So sounds like it's starting to be done like that.
Exactly. It's a problem that plagues a lot of scientific research, is that it doesn't tend to be representative of populations and countries outside of the Western norm, right? So outside of developed countries. So, and that's extremely true of sensitivity as well. So there is this drive now to try and study sensitivity in sort of wider contexts and in different cultures.
Yeah. That's really cool. Yeah. Was it anything in particular that when you started learning about sensitivity, when you read the book and everything, that really felt like yes, that makes so much sense? Like,
I think it's just that it helps you reframe so much of what you experience growing up. I think obviously there were signs of my sensitivity from a young age. I was in a primary school, an all boys primary school, and I fell in love with the library from the get-go, and I used to get lost in books, and then I became very fascinated by chess, and I enjoyed sort of individual sports like tennis. So there were all these signs that I was different to a traditional boy of that age, and yeah, it helped me reframe a lot of that. I think there was a lot of pressure going to an all-boys school. They tried to instill in me the beliefs that were common at the time about how young boys should behave and sort of masculine ideals. And so you pick up as a young child a feeling of being somehow broken or inferior or doing it incorrectly. And having and some resources about sensitivity and learning more about it really helps to reframe that picture and helps you to understand and appreciate that, no, there wasn't ever anything wrong with me. It was just that who I was and who I am as an individual didn't sort of gel with what society and what culture at the time really wanted. And that can be a huge relief. So I just found the whole experience a tremendous relief, because it felt like it took the pressure off my shoulders to conform. It gave me a reason to say, okay, this is who I am. This is who I can be. And, there are legitimate reasons. And I felt like the more I studied the literature, the more I delved into the science, the more that became clearer to me. And just, it was such a revelation. I think that's why I wanted to study it further.
Yeah, that's really cool. And that sort of takes us nicely into talking about the I mean, yeah, the research itself, the measures of research and the things that have been discovered over the past, I suppose, what is it, 30 years or so, since Elaine Aron started doing research under that banner of sensory processing sensitivity, high sensitivity, the highly sensitive person. So, yeah, maybe let's just kind of touch on that a little bit, kind of go through the history of sensitivity research and the way that it's been measured. So you delivered a presentation kind of looking at the new HSPR scale.
Yes.
And sort of talking about, why that's been introduced. And you went through the other areas that have been looked at. So brain stimulation, genetics, and stress as sort of core components of sensitivity research. So, maybe I'll just throw all of that at you and kind of make sense of, the history of sensitivity research, where we've been and where we're up to now, I suppose.
Yes, sure. I think we can start with what you mentioned at the beginning about measurement. And so I think everyone is familiar with the original highly sensitive person scale, which Elaine and her husband Arthur published back in 1997. And that's been a sort of a long-standing measure now of sensitivity. It's what we have used mostly in research in order to investigate sensitivity. So it took a long time for that scale to be investigated and for it to gain traction in the literature. But then starting from about 2018, we started to see new instruments that measured sensitivity. So in 2018, we had the publication of the highly sensitive child scale to start looking at sensitivity in children. And then a number of additional scales for children started to appear, because obviously measurement in children, is very important because that's where we can have the most effect in terms of changing the narrative about sensitivity and helping the future generation be alleviated of some of the burdens that us as adults grew up with when knowledge about sensitivity wasn't very common. So there are, in addition to a self-report version for children aged 8 to 18, there's also a parent report version. So if parents want to assess the behavior of their children, there's also a school-based version that can help teachers to assess the sensitivity of children within a classroom setting. And then there's also what's known as the highly sensitive child rating scale. So this is also a parent report version that can be used for children as young as 3 years old. So children who aren't able to answer a questionnaire themselves, pre-verbal, this allows parents to start to get a sense of the sensitivity of their child. And in the past few years, we've started to see now revisions to the adult scale, because now that we've used the scale for a long time, it's become clear that there are strengths and limitations to that scale. Particularly, there's quite a number of limitations, and so there's been this drive to try and correct some of those flaws. And so I think from 2022, there was a new adult scale called the SBS questionnaire that was published. There is another one called the DOES questionnaire, or the DOES questionnaire. But over the past few years, Elaine and Michael have also been working on a revised version of the original scale, which has just recently been published, called the HSPR. And so, yes, that's now a new format of the adult scale, and one we are now hoping to use more consistently and in more research to study it in more detail. So that's where we're at in terms of measurement. While we do have this new scale that we want to investigate further and apply to a whole number of different research areas, we've obviously already discovered quite a bit with the original scale. Despite its flaws, it's still been an incredibly useful tool that's allowed us to understand sensitivity in so many different contexts. And you spoke about some of those. So one of those contexts is understanding the highly sensitive brain, right? So by using the tool to earmark and identify highly sensitive people, we've then been able to gather groups of those people in order to do brain imaging studies. And that's helped us to identify regions of the brain that seem to be particularly linked to highly sensitive people and different networks of the brain, different neural networks. And we've also embarked on studies looking at genetics and physiology of highly sensitive people. Because obviously, when you have a highly sensitive nervous system, that has to have symptoms or that has to have signs within your own physiology. And there should also be genetic underpinnings to that that explain those differences in sensitivity. So that's been a large part of the research. And of course, as you mentioned, a lot of research is also focused on the fact that highly sensitive people are unfortunately more susceptible to mental health issues. And so there's been a lot of research in understanding that and understanding that sort of stress sensitivity and the risk of burnout and so on and so forth as a way of illuminating that risk and trying to think of ways that we can intervene and help mitigate those problems for highly sensitive persons. So yes, that's just a very broad overview. I'm happy to dive into more particulars of any one of those regions if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, that last bit, the stress, there's been a recent paper published on that I know. Were you involved with that?
So you're referring to the recent meta-analysis that a colleague of mine, Tom Falkenstein, did, sort of getting an overview of high sensitivity and mental health. Mm-hmm. And so I wasn't personally involved with that. This is work that Tom has done as part of his PhD that he is doing at the moment. And yes, he gathered all of the studies to date on sensitivity and mental health. And he looked at what's the overall consensus, which is really how we get a feel for where the field is at and what we know. Obviously, individual studies are great, but we really need to gather that evidence together to get an overall sense of what scientific research is telling us. And yes, through Tom's review, through his meta-analysis, he has found that on average, most studies have shown this susceptibility that highly sensitive people have towards anxiety and depression in particular. And that's well known. I think that's something that won't come as a surprise to highly sensitive people. It is very much a lived experience for us. We know that that is the challenge that comes joined to the many benefits of being highly sensitive. That's the weakness to our strength, that we have this mental illness burden, especially if we're placed in environments that are very stressful. So yes, that's it's been good to have that awareness and to know more about the exact risk, to be able to quantify that.
Yeah, and it's been frustrating to see the framing. So it's been picked up by certain media outlets and news sites and newspapers, and a lot of the framing, or some of the framing, has been around the personality type that is most likely to have mental illness or whatever. I think what I've found frustrating about that framing is that it sees things at the individual level rather than at a broader societal or cultural level, and asking the question, because I think one of the areas that's so important in sensitivity research is obviously sort of vantage sensitivity, differential susceptibility, which is that idea that, you know, a sensitive person is more impacted by their environment than less sensitive people, for better or worse. So it's kind of, you can flourish in the right conditions, but you might suffer if that, environment isn't conducive to your sensitive nervous system. But in popular culture, it rarely goes to the point of like, okay, what could we be doing better to make sure that the sensitive among us, 20 to 30% of us, are actually able to bring the best of themselves into the world, into cultures. Instead, it reinforces that they're weak narrative, I suppose.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and it's not just in sort of popular media, unfortunately. So it's a well-established problem in the literature, and not just psychology literature, and all scientific literature. There tends to be a negativity bias, and that's really an innate part of human psychology. Unfortunately, we are biased towards the negative because it's more important for us to take notice of negative information on our environment in terms of our survival. So we pay more attention to it. And so there's a benevolent and noble goal of scientific research. We want to help out, right? And so we want to think of interventions. We want to mitigate problems. But in doing so, there is this focus on the negative. Psychological research focuses on pathology, on mental disorder. And when we study environments, we tend to focus on environments that are quite negative. So we look at children who come from traumatized backgrounds. We look at abuse. We look at all these very negative environmental contexts, all these negative personality traits. And it does create this sense of tremendous negativity. And it's what has obscured the research on sensitivity to a large degree. The previous framing of sensitive people as being vulnerable, as being at risk, just really heightening this idea that sensitive people are somehow flawed or in danger. And so it's hard work to correct that. Even though we know it as psychologists, we know about this negativity bias, it's still very slow and difficult to enact change. So if we think about the sensitivity research space at the moment, most sensitivity research is on mental illness and psychopathology as it relates to sensitivity. So kind of like Tom's work and reviewing all of the articles that have been published to date and looking at mental health in highly sensitive people. So that remains the focus. And again, it's because we want to help highly sensitive people, but it builds this narrative which the popular media picks up on, in that somehow sensitive people that's the only part that matters about them, is this risk that they have. And they forget that there are these tremendous strengths that are paired with that weakness. And so I think only about maybe the third or fourth most common research area is positive psychology, right? In how it relates to highly sensitive people, looking at highly sensitive people in nature, looking at the benefits of connectedness with nature and with animals, and studying the sort of aesthetic sensitivity part of highly sensitive people, their creativity, their interior lives and how rich those are. That's a part of psychology research, but it represents a much smaller proportion of the total research agenda at the moment. So it's unfortunate because as you've mentioned, it drives this narrative that only highlights the challenges that characterize highly sensitive people without giving due regard to what we can do really well, where we flourish.
Yeah, I know that, and that was a big part of the drive towards updating the scale, wasn't it? To change that negativity bias that are within the particular points on the scale. Maybe that's a good chance to talk about why this new HSPR scale was important, and what are the factors that went into designing it.
Yes, sure. So it's a common question that people have, because we've had the scale for so long, and so many people wonder. We've had the original scale for so long and it's worked so well. Why do we need a new scale? What were the flaws? What motivated for the change in the scale and developing a new one? And so there were many reasons. There were many flaws to the original scale that needed correction. So the first and most obvious was that the original scale, when Elaine and Arthur designed it, is that it was meant to capture this one idea of sensitivity, of being a highly sensitive person. And when Elaine did her first sort of psychometric assessment of the scale that she developed, it seemed like she had developed the scale that measured this one idea of sensitivity. But as the scale got used in larger samples in different contexts, it became evident that the scale was actually measuring distinct facets of sensitivity. Right? Sensitivity isn't just this one idea, it's actually a number of elements, right, that make up a highly sensitive person. And initially, when the scale was used in developed and Western countries, it seemed like there were three main facets to sensitivity, and many people will know these three facets. So they include ease of excitation, or EOE, low sensory threshold, LST, and aesthetic sensitivity, AES. Those seem to be the three main facets. And those have been the dominant three facets we've spoken about in terms of sensitivity research. But when the measure started to spread into different cultural contexts, it seemed like more facets began to emerge. So there was a study that was done in a Turkish population that suggested there were actually four facets to sensitivity. As part of my PhD, I looked at the original scale and administered it to eclectic multicultural samples within South Africa, which is really known for its multicultural context. And my research suggested that there were five different facets to sensitivity. So at that point, it became really confusing. How many facets are there to sensitivity? So that was part one of the reason why we needed to revise the scale, because there was so much confusion. The second is that as we've continued to do more sensitivity research, the crux of being a highly sensitive person appears to be depth of processing. That really seems to be the main feature. It's the quality of our processing, how deep we consider our environmental stimulation. That is the main characteristic of highly sensitive people. But if we look at the original scale now in hindsight, we see that most items don't actually measure depth of processing. What they measure is overwhelm. And overwhelm is an important part of being highly sensitive, but it's not, as research has shown, it's not the crux, it's not the critical component of being a highly sensitive person. So that's another issue that's needed to be addressed. The third is the negative wording of the original scale. So if you look over the items of the original highly sensitive person scale, you'll see words like rattled and annoyed, and you'll see all those items that assess overwhelm that again reflect what we were discussing earlier about the negativity bias, that we lean into this negativity by accident sometimes. And we can see that in the original scale. And the trouble with having so much of a negative focus in those items is that the scale starts to pick up neuroticism, which is one of the 5 fundamental personality attributes. And neuroticism does share some correlation with sensitivity, but it's not a defining feature of being highly sensitive. So again, we don't really want a scale that picks up on another personality feature, right? We're trying to measure sensitivity in isolation. So that was the third problem. And the fourth main problem was that something we spoke about earlier is that the majority of sensitivity research has taken place in what we call weird countries in psychology, which stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So those are sort of the 5 characteristics that define the richest countries in terms of resources and where most scientific research takes place. If we think of like the UK and the US and other European countries. Those are the 5 characteristics that are common to all of them. And unfortunately, those are not representative of the majority of the human population, right? So science is biased in that sense, and that means we're not getting the best estimate of what sensitivity really means globally across populations. So these were sort of the 4 main driving factors of saying we need to revise the original scale to make a new scale that addresses those concerns. That's less negative, that takes into account the latest research, and that is more culturally sensitive.
It's really fascinating. Yeah. And is there the element of the quality of responses or the subjectivity versus objectivity of a person's response? Obviously, there's an element of that you can't mitigate for. We know, I think, that the sensitivity is equal in men and women, but men seem to come out of a lot of the survey responses with scoring lower on sensitivity because there's maybe a cultural bias towards how should I answer this, or how, like, it might not even be a conscious decision. It's this is what I'm supposed to be. And I've integrated that into my self-understanding or self-concept. Yeah.
You're exactly right. It's another really important point. We know that there are these biases in responding to the original scale, but these are biases that are not unique to the highly sensitive person scale. These are biases, at least some of them are biases common to all of self-reports instruments that we use in psychology. So in terms of ones that are very common to the highly sensitive person scale, you mentioned the sort of sex bias that we see, the difference in response between men and women. That in the original scale, we note that women on average score higher than men. And that's because men tend to do what's known as faking bad in psychology. So they will tend to underreport their sensitivity because of cultural conditioning, right? We know that traditional masculine ideas don't promote sensitivity, they don't value it. And so men feel compelled not to reveal their sensitivity or not to own up to it in any sort of major way. And so they'll underreport those behaviors and score lower. So faking bad is a significant problem. And the other problem is what we call social desirability bias. There are some facets of sensitivity that people would like to believe apply to them, right? Even if it may not be true. If you're asked the question, are you conscientious? Most people are not, will want to agree with that because if you say no, it sounds like you're almost insulting yourself. So it's a really tricky part of psychology to try and ask a question without eliciting these biases. And while there have been efforts now to rebalance that in the revised version, and it does seem to have worked in terms of sort of trying to balance out the response between men and women, unfortunately, those problems are always going to be inherent to self-report in psychology. There's always going to be this element of how accurate are people being when they respond to questions? How much attention are they paying? It's just something we can't avoid entirely, but we can try our best to sort of balance it out and mitigate it where possible. So there have been revisions to the questions in that sense to try and make them less socially desirable, and that helps people to sort of respond more accurately.
Yeah. It must be so difficult to get that, and you're never going to get it perfect, are you? It's a kind of iterative process of, okay, we're getting closer, but yeah. On the I think it was the social sensitivity questions that you'd put in the presentation. I was struck by that social desirability bias in thinking about how I'd respond to, do you easily recognize what others are feeling, or how some people might respond to these questions? Are you good at anticipating how someone may feel about a situation? Which, again, for people who might see sensitivity as a part of them or see it as something that's desirable, you're going to think that you do that, not necessarily confirm that you do that. But then the third question that you have is, do other people tell you that you're good at understanding what they are feeling or thinking? And it's almost like, that the evidence, is there evidence that you do that from the way that other people, sort of relate back to you, your sensitivity or lack thereof?
Yeah, exactly. So you pick up on that point that it's almost impossible to sidestep that there is going to be this element of biased responding in these questions. And, it touches on another avenue of research focus at the moment about trying to find more objective ways of assessing sensitivity. So are there ways that we can measure a person's physiology and be able to make that distinction of whether they're highly sensitive or not? Are there genetic variants that we can assess? It sounds great on paper, but unfortunately, the research shows it's very complex to do that, unfortunately. But using some of those biological markers and metrics might be a way for us to help augment and support what we measure through psychological instrumentation. As with everything in life, there are pros and cons to any form of measurement. So we really need to think about what's the best sort of holistic approach to trying to measure sensitivity while sidestepping some of these problems that we know about.
Yeah, I can see how, everything, I suppose with the 50% genetic factors, 50% environmental, already tells you that you're dealing with complex interweaving elements of all sorts of things. To find highly objective measures, whether quantitative or like studied through scans and things like that, it's going to be tough.
Yes. Yes, it is a tall order, trying to find some objective markers. But that's like I said, that's an ongoing area of research. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done, and hopefully over time we will build this consensus and we'll understand the sort of biological mechanisms that underpin sensitivity and how it operates.
Yeah. And that's exciting. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a really fascinating area of research, and obviously all of these small steps help along the journey of developing this picture of high sensitivity and how it functions.
And does that bring you back round to what you were originally studying in terms of the science, the biology, and yeah, bringing all of that together, really?
Yeah, so the research I've been doing for the past 3 years, looking at refugee children, has been exactly that, about looking
Right.
at the genetics and the biology and the psychology of these refugee children and trying to put these pieces together at different levels to see what makes up a highly sensitive person, what makes up a highly sensitive child, what are all the different signs and clues that we can pick up on so that we can detect sensitivity, if from multiple different angles, right, and build a fuller picture. Because the better able we are to do that, obviously, the easier it will be for us to direct help and assistance towards people, right? So it'll be easier to earmark and distinguish highly sensitive people, and then in any context thereafter, whether it's children, whether it's adolescents at school, whether it's adults in the workplace, we'll be able to then target interventions according to sensitivity. That's really the ultimate goal of where we would like to head, right? To start thinking about how do we assist people based on their different levels of sensitivity, because we know that highly sensitive people respond so well to a positive and nurturing environment. So they really stand to benefit from any kind of positive intervention. And that's where we will see them excel. So that's really the goal of this mechanistic research, is making sure we can make a clear distinction based on, scientifically grounded evidence, and then we really have that foundation to be able to offer interventions and support for highly sensitive people. And also for people, at the other end of the spectrum, so the dandelions, right? They also need a different approach, right? So it's not just about highly sensitive people, but it's about understanding that entire sensitivity spectrum and how we need to modify our approaches when working with people of different sensitivities.
Oh, that's such a good point. Yeah. And yeah, you can see that sort of almost playing out in elements of the so-called culture wars and things like that, where you've got everybody battling for their own thing, or yeah, and then feeling imposed upon by the other side or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, it's such a good point, Andy. Like, what we don't ever want to do is drive an us versus them narrative through our research. So it's not like we're trying to separate out sensitive people from non-sensitive people in any kind of way that frames sensitive people as being special somehow, or advantaged or disadvantaged, or whatever the case may be. We really want to just point out that these are different parts of the spectrum. So not better or worse, just different, really. So that's the motto, is we're just showing that people are different. We need to understand these differences in order to be able to provide effective help, effective intervention. And so, yes, we have to be so careful not to lean into these culture wars that tend to erupt as soon as that us versus them narrative becomes established. So yes, it really is about understanding the spectrum, but the focus is a lot on highly sensitive people, because that's been neglected. That's the part that's been confused in previous psychological research. And I think we see that in highly sensitive people who are so hungry for a narrative that reframes who they are, away from how psychology has framed it previously, a narrative of brokenness and dysfunction, and now correcting that and showing that actually there are real strengths to this. It's a neutral personality trait. There are pros and cons, and that puts it on the same level as everyone else, as the people at the opposite end of the sensitivity spectrum.
Absolutely. Yeah. A noble cause. So, and I think one of the things I'm often talking about is the role of sensitivity in that wider societal context, and the fact that, it's evolved with us as a species. It's not just an individual survival strategy. It must be part of that broader collective. And actually, in studying it in the way that you're describing, it's not about finding another label to apply to individuals that they can then use to be special or whatever. It's how can we see that whole spectrum as part of who we are as humans, and make that space for sensitivity to rise, kind of like that idea of, the sensitivity rising of the movie that they put out, but actually how that it rises culturally, not just within a person. And when we do that, I feel like maybe we would get ourselves onto better trajectories than maybe we're doing at the moment.
I wholeheartedly agree with that as well. And, I try and say that as objectively as possible, obviously identifying as a highly sensitive man myself. But, it's something Carl Jung picked up on many, many years ago when he was still alive. Carl Jung considered perhaps the first person to speak about high sensitivity or innate sensitiveness as he framed it. But back when he was alive, he spoke about how the importance of people with innate sensitiveness or high sensitivity. He said that their lives teach the other possibility, the interior life, which is so painfully wanting in our civilization. And I think if he recognized that in his time, I think it has only become more true in the modern world. And I think that also justifies why we have such a focus on high sensitivity at the moment. Because I think there is a real lesson that highly sensitive people can teach about the interior life, about spiritual awareness and enrichment. All of these sorts of ideas and things that we've forgotten in a sort of modern capitalist world that tends to advertise and promote quantity over quality. If we think about the advent of the internet, social media, and now AI, those three things alone have caused such an information overload on society, and we can see the negative effects that that's having in terms of the mental health epidemic, the loneliness epidemic that plagues the modern world. Everything is about quantity. It's about making as much money as possible, and there being as much information as possible. And what we're missing from that equation now is a balance back towards quality, right? And away from quantity towards quality. And that's what highly sensitive people, in my mind, are built for. That's what we seek naturally, right? We want quality relationships. We like deep friendships with a handful of people rather than an entire social network of hundreds of acquaintances. We like to focus on one task at a time instead of multitasking, right? And we like to do a good job. And again, that's not something that's promoted in the modern world of working. It's all about how much can you juggle and how accomplished are you and how many different projects are you involved in. So I think there is such a need for the voice of highly sensitive people to be elevated and to be heard because it helps to balance out some of where we've lost our way in modern society in terms of prioritizing too much on the quantity side and not enough on the quality side.
Yeah. Couldn't agree more. Yeah. Very well said. And so as we sort of come into land, I suppose, it'd be great to just look at a few questions that I know you've explored through that presentation, but it's something that really resonated with me because I was thinking about the comments that I often receive when I talk about high sensitivity from people, whether it's on social media or YouTube, whatever, and people hear the behaviors and traits and tendencies that I might be describing, and they say, oh, that belongs to this other category. And the questions, is high sensitivity the same as autism? Is high sensitivity the same as ADHD? Is high sensitivity the same as giftedness? Yeah, I'll pass those questions over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And yes, they're very, very common, as you say. Not always easy to answer, but I'll give you the current consensus of where we stand in terms of answering those questions. So I think first and foremost, the question about is high sensitivity the same as autism? I think that's the most common. And so I find it helpful to first think about why does this question come up so often? What are the areas of confusion that lead to this question? And first and foremost, it is possible to be a highly sensitive person, a person who has sensory processing sensitivity, and be diagnosed with autism. So both can be true. They are not mutually exclusive. They can co-occur in the same individual. So that's one of the reasons for confusion. The second is that when qualitative studies have been done on highly sensitive people, so studies that have asked about their lived experiences, so instead of quantifying and using numbers and statistics, this is more about just exploring the lives of highly sensitive people. We know that as environments become more stressful, highly sensitive people show traits that are more autistic-like. Right, so when we're stressed, we tend to withdraw to try and reduce sensory overwhelm. Our mental faculties shut down a little bit. We become rattled, we become annoyed. And so that on the surface can look very similar to an individual with autism also sort of shutting down from sensory overload. So that's an area for confusion. And another area is that obviously autism occurs along a spectrum, and at the high functioning end, high functioning autism, that can very much resemble high sensitivity. It can be very difficult to distinguish those two traits. So if there's ever any confusion, I always recommend that people seek professional assistance in those cases, because I think high functioning autism and high sensitivity do share a strong overlap, but they're still different and they require different strategies to help in those two scenarios. So those are the areas of confusion and overlap. But what we currently believe is the distinction between autism and high sensitivity is what we call theory of mind in psychology, the ability to understand what other people are thinking or feeling, what their intentions are, what their actions might be. And for highly sensitive people, that comes naturally. We're really skilled at understanding how other people might feel, what other people might think, and what their actions might be. That comes naturally to us. We're extremely empathetic as a people, and without much training, we just know. I mean, I'm often when I speak to highly sensitive people, they speak about being the counselor amongst their friends. So, right, everyone comes to speak to them about their problems because we find it really easy to relate and to be able to understand how other people must be feeling. That's traditionally not true of people on the autism spectrum disorder. That's an area where they struggle. So people with autism tend to have difficulty in understanding how other people think and feel and understanding social cues and so on. So that seems to be the main distinction. For a long time, and probably still to today, there's a misconception that the distinction is in empathy. So obviously, highly sensitive people are extremely empathetic, and there has been this narrative that people with autism are less empathetic, but research has shown that that's not the case. People with autism are completely capable of empathy. So that used to be an area where we thought there might be a distinction, but now we know that, or now the focus really is on the main, what we believe to be the main distinction, and that's theory of mind. It's a very similar answer for the case of ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So again, it's possible to have sensory processing sensitivity and be diagnosed with ADHD. And under those stressful circumstances, it's very easy for highly sensitive people to lose focus and to become agitated. And again, from an outside perspective, that can look very much like ADHD. Soon as someone becomes rattled and you can't really focus on one task at a time. But the distinction here is one of impulsivity. So the prime characteristic of a highly sensitive person is that we tend to default to pausing to check whenever we're faced with novelty. So we won't dive in to an unknown situation. We'll hang around the periphery, we'll observe, we'll take our time, and then we'll act based on what we've seen and what we've learned. People with ADHD have more difficulty with that. They lean more towards impulsive decisions. So making snap judgments, making snap decisions. It's not to say that highly sensitive people don't ever do that. I think often as a way of reducing overwhelm and reducing sort of the tyranny of choice, we might impulsively just choose one option over the next as a way of escaping from stimulation. So again, you can see that the lines are not clear here. There is this blur. But by and large, if we look on average, we will see that highly sensitive people will pause to check, whereas people with ADHD are more prone to leaning on the sort of taking impulsive action. And then lastly, the story of giftedness. This is where it becomes even more complicated. So this really highlights a huge challenge in all of research, and that's one of definition, right? So the very first step of definition, of research is defining what it is you want to research. And defining giftedness is a huge problem. It's a really difficult thing to do. What does it mean to be gifted? Is it gifted cognitively, or can you be gifted in the way you move your body? For example, a dancer, is that gifted? Is gifted something you're born with, or can you develop it in a really nurturing environment as a child? So there are all these questions that plague what it means to be gifted. And this is something that applies really to all of research. It's true even if we think about something like personality. How do you define a personality? If I was to say to you, Andy, I want to include you in my research and I want to study your personality, where should I begin? It's really difficult to know what is it that characterizes. It's something we intuitively know, but to define it on paper is much more difficult. So definition, first part of scientific research, but arguably one of the most difficult. So that's exactly the problem of giftedness. It's difficult to know exactly how to define it. And the reason for confusion is that we know that highly sensitive people are very creative, right? And in good environments, highly sensitive people have the capacity to flourish beyond less sensitive individuals, so beyond the dandelions. So they do have this capacity to excel beyond what's traditionally expected. And that definitely resembles a degree of giftedness. The distinction is perhaps that sensitivity is just one potential component of giftedness. So giftedness comes in many varieties, and that's why we've struggled to define it. But what researchers have shown is that a common denominator to gifted people is what Salman Daglio calls heightened multifaceted sensitivity. And there is another researcher who referred to it as overexcitability, right? So in all gifted people, there is this element of sensitivity or of having an overexcited response, which is exactly what we see in sensitive individuals. So that seems to be a common denominator. And yes, that very much overlaps with what it means to be a sensitive person. But there are often other components that apply to giftedness, for example, a photographic memory, or maybe a particular body type that really favors what you're gifted in, for example, swimming or dancing or whatever the case may be. And also just from a statistical point of view, we know that only about 2 to 3% of the population are considered gifted by the current definition, whereas up to 30% of the population are highly sensitive. So just from a statistical standpoint, highly sensitive, sensory processing sensitivity can't be tantamount to giftedness. But what I can say anecdotally, and I think this is an area where a lot more research needs to be, I do think that sensitivity is a foundation upon which giftedness can be built. If we're saying it's a common denominator, I do think sensitivity does provide a foundation for that. Obviously, you need all these other ingredients. But yes, they're not one and the same. And it's very important. important to make that distinction because I know a lot of highly sensitive people want to believe in that narrative, and I know it's often advertised that we have these superpowers, that we're really skilled and capable. And although that's really benevolent and it's part of reframing sensitivity and focusing on the strengths, it can be counterproductive. Because if every highly sensitive person believes they're gifted, that A drives an us versus them narrative, which we want to avoid, and B, it applies incredible pressure, right? If you believe that you're supposed to somehow have this tremendous potential and your life currently hasn't turned out in a way that feels like it's demonstrated that, that can be hugely damaging to your self-esteem and to your mental health. So it's very important to make that distinction, but I think it's an area that requires a lot more research because of that issue of definition. What do we mean by giftedness? Yes, a lot more work to be done there, but hopefully that provides some clarity and distinction between sensitivity and those high sensitivity and those sensitivity related traits.
It's really helpful. Yeah, thank you. That sort of just reminds me of do quite a lot of work with highly sensitive people who have kind of adopted perfectionistic tendencies based on some of those stories that they've integrated from those around them, maybe growing up, that you're whether it's you're the good girl or you're the good boy or you're really, really talented at this, and then suddenly the pressure and the expectation that is piled on themselves is a really big burden to have to bear. And it adds up into that self-concept of, in order to be worthy or acceptable and to belong, I need to constantly be striving for better and to be the best, and so just sort of working themselves into the ground just to keep afloat in that sense.
Exactly. It's such a good point. I think a lot of highly sensitive people come to light as children because they show this real skill, this capacity, this potential. And as you say, as they move into adulthood, the sort of stress, the minority stress we call it, of being sensitive in a largely insensitive world builds. And so a lot of that capacity for the strengths of sensitivity can get lost in the way. So it's another huge problem is that a lot of psychology focuses on what's observable, right? It's easy to study things that we can see. And so when we think about defining giftedness, it's often about what we can see, right? It's really easy to see a chess prodigy, right? Or someone who's really gifted at a skill, but it's less obvious to see someone who might be emotionally gifted, right? Who has a real skill at working with other people and understanding intention. It might not always be easy to see someone who's sort of gifted cognitively, right? Unless they show it through some sort of academic achievement. So I think a lot of giftedness goes under the radar, and that just adds confusion to the whole problem. And it's just part and parcel of the issue, and why we have to be so careful when we have this discussion about sensitivity as well, because we have to think that although there is this capacity, there is also this real world pressure, this minority stress on highly sensitive people.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for taking the time to kind of go through this. Endlessly fascinating. Is there anything else that you think maybe would be useful to share? Anything that we've missed that you'd like to point people towards, or anything like that?
I think for me, what always brings me comfort, what I always try to remind myself, although I study sensitivity on a daily basis, I struggle with all the same things that highly sensitive people do. And much to my frustration, because I always feel like I should know better being a sensitivity researcher, but I still have the same daily battles with my own sensitivity and the same joys, that counterbalance those frustrations. But I always have to remind myself, especially as the modern world seems to become more and more chaotic, is I bring myself back to the idea that highly sensitive people are not themselves disordered. We just live in a disordered society. So as soon as I can feel myself sort of nitpicking at my flaws as a highly sensitive person, I try to remind myself of that fact, that it's really the society we live in that is unfortunately disordered, and we should always remember to separate ourselves from that. Yes, we might experience a lot of pressure. We might be in this, 30% minority versus the 70% majority, but we need to be so careful and need to constantly remind ourselves that we should never take that as a symbol of brokenness or a reason to be hard or on ourselves or mean about who we are. We do have skills, we do have strengths, and yes, it's just a matter of finding those and making them the focal point of our lives.
Perfectly said. Yes, we are not disordered. We just live in a disordered world. Yeah, I love that. Well, thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, Andy.
There we are. How was that for you? A huge thank you to Andrew May for taking the time to join me and chat about all of that stuff. I could talk about it for hours, and often do. If you would like to explore this stuff further, then I would invite you to join me in the Haven community, which is our online village for Gentle Rebels. And we sort of explore this stuff, explore a load of other stuff as well. But it's a community with many sensitive people in it, and those who tend to think and feel deeply about things. So if you're hearing about some of these ideas that we've talked about in this episode, and you're thinking, oh, that sounds really familiar to me, but alien to my experience of what is considered normal, then it's a great place to come and meet people who you don't need to explain yourself to in that sense. So yes, I will put a link in the description. You can come and check it out. Maybe you like the idea of joining, but you're not sure. I'll happily answer any questions that you have. Just drop me a message and it'd be lovely to hear from you. All right, I think that's us for this episode. Thank you so much for listening, and I will be back again soon with another one. Until then, do remember that you are an artist. The world needs your art. Now go and make somebody's day. Bye-bye.
So shines a good deed in a weary world.
Angels in disguise, we can be